Hello, everyone. Welcome to our sixth session of the 2022 to 2023 Forest and Climate Learning Exchange Series. I'm your host, Tony Mazza, and I am the Natural Resource Policy Specialist at the Society of American Foresters. So the Society of American Foresters, also known as SAF, is the national scientific and educational organization representing forestry and related natural resource professionals across the US. We were founded in 1900, and SAF promotes science-based, sustainable management and stewardship of the nation's public and private forests. I also want to give a quick thanks to our co-host, Michigan State University's Forest Carbon and Climate Program, or FCCP. FCCP connects diverse forest stakeholders and the broader public with the value of forested lands and forest products, and addressing climate change through courses, videos, workshops, and other knowledge transfer materials, as well as policy relevant research on forest carbon and harvested wood products. Similarly, a quick thank you to our additional sponsors, NCX, as well as Renew West. So for today's presentations, we'll be discussing resilience, equity, and nature-based climate solutions in New York City. First, we will hear from Emily Noble Maxwell, who is New York City's Program Director at the Nature Conservancy. As a co-founder of the Forests for All NYC Coalition, Maxwell will discuss some of the key issues and needs for urban forestry investments in New York City and the ongoing research, organizing, and action informed by the coalition's work to date. After that, we'll hear from Timon McPhearson, who is Professor of Urban Ecology and Director of the Urban Systems Lab at the New School. McPhearson will discuss the UN IPCC report on climate change and nature-based solutions, as well as the Biden-Harris administration's recent commitment to developing and implementing a roadmap for nature-based solutions. Thank you both for joining us today. Before we get started, I'd like to briefly share a few housekeeping details. So to automatically receive registration details and information regarding upcoming webinars, please join our mailing list by emailing forestc@msu.edu. A recording of this session, along with a copy of the slides and any supplemental resources, will be posted to the FCCP website shortly. Additionally, the presentation today will be followed by a Q&A that will last approximately 10 to 15 minutes. You can use the chat or the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom interface to submit your questions at any point during the presentation. We'll do our best to address as many questions as possible, but there are always more than we can get to. You can also send questions directly to forestc@msu.edu. So attendees today are qualified to receive CFE credit from SAF. These credits will be automatically applied if you register for the event with the email associated with your SAF account. Similarly, attendees are qualified to receive CEU credits from ISA. So please email forestc@msu.edu to receive the event code necessary to receive those credits. So with that, I will now pass it over to Emily Maxwell to begin the presentation. Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody, and Tony, thank you for such a terrific welcome, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and certainly with my colleague, Timon McPhearson. So I'm Emily Noble Maxwell. I'm the city's program director at the Nature Conservancy in New York, and just briefly, the Nature Conservancy is a global conservation organization that works either directly or in partnership in more than 70 countries. And our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. I wanted to sort of start by saying the urban forest, which is my area of specialty, it makes headlines these days. I think in the time of my career, working on urban forest issues, the past couple of years, I would say we've seen a lot of news stories on it. And a lot of what you're seeing here has to do with inequities in tree canopy, the need for investments, and focus on environmental justice, as well as the threats of storm and budgets. So the Nature Conservancy launched about 4 years ago a new initiative called Future Forest NYC, And I'm going to be sharing some high-level findings from this and taking you on a deep dive. And we really work in a few capacities. We produce new science and analysis of the urban forest in New York City. We collaborate with others to advance strategies for the urban forest. We convene a coalition called Forest for All NYC, which you'll learn more about, and we seek to influence policy. But obviously, the theme of today's talk is about resilience and equity. So you'll note that a lot of our work does have this focus. And one of the reasons that we selected the issues around urban forestry to work on in New York City is because as climate change continues to worsen, and as we know, extreme heat days are expanding by 3 to 5 times by the 2080s, and that extreme heat is the #1 weather-related threat to human health in the United States, alongside with the fact that also in that time frame, we're anticipating 1.5 times the amount of precipitation, which means more localized flooding. The urban forest is one great solution set. And so all of our work really is encapsulated in the frame of working to address climate change, both from a mitigation and an adaptation standpoint. So many of you on this call are probably familiar with the concept of urban heat island. And I want to name urban heat island is not a function only of climate change. Urban heat island itself is a function of more impervious surface, more waste heat, and less vegetation in highly urbanized areas. And climate change is making its impacts worse. But we do know that when we look at the city across at a broad scale on hot summer days, that areas that have more vegetation tend to be cooler. And this is a really big deal when we also know that the health impacts of extreme heat are not proportionally distributed, and Black New Yorkers are facing more illness and death than their counterparts. So this is a very significant equity and justice issue. So I do want to take a step back for a moment for those of you who aren't familiar with the urban forest in New York City. The urban forest of New York City includes over 7 million trees, as well as the physical and social infrastructure that supports them. We're going to go into more depth on this, but it's tremendously important to me from my body of practice and research that I sort of convey that we think about both the physical resilience of the forest and the physical distribution of equity, but the social systems that both support and are supported by the urban forest also need to be attended to when it comes to resilience. So we really take this notion of a socio-ecological system quite seriously. So I think many of you in this call will be more familiar with this, but the urban forest has tremendous benefits, and these benefits are not all only painted in this picture, but these are some of the more significant benefits, and all of this can be found in our State of the Urban Forest in New York City report. They help to remove and sequester pollution and carbon. They help decrease both surface and air temperature. Exposure to trees can help reduce stress and encourage exercise and activity. Planning and stewarding around trees can help increase community cohesion, which is tremendously important in the face of extreme weather events by bringing neighbors together. There is obviously huge water filtration benefits, and of course, the biodiversity benefits of our urban forest. So this is clearly not an exhaustive list, but I don't think I need to persuade this particular crowd of the benefits of trees. So I want to take you on a bit of a ride through canopy and trees in New York City. We're going to think about budget. We're going to think about potential expansion, and we're going to talk about what we're doing about it. So that's sort of the arc of my talk. The most recent data we have available for New York City that has been processed is Canopy as of 2017. So this data is based on LiDAR, remotely sensed data. And our tree canopy, as you can see, for those of you who don't know New York City, we're made up of 5 boroughs. It is inequitably distributed across those boroughs, with Brooklyn having just under 18%, and Staten Island, which is a more suburban district, having over 30%. But the story is much more nuanced than that. And so when we look at the map on the right, we can see that that heterogeneity plays out much more starkly, with some neighborhoods having as low as 3% canopy, some as high as 78%, while there is a citywide average of 22%. We also were able to take a look at canopy change over time. And the two data points that were comparable were 2010 to 2017. We're working on getting data for 2021 so we can continue to track trends. And at the macro scale, it's actually a pretty good story for New York City, even in the face of the fact that we are losing canopy generally in many cities nationwide. In New York City, we gained about 2% canopy from 2010 to 2017 on average, but the yellows, reds, and oranges on the map on the right are actually where we experience canopy loss. So again, when we look at this finer scale, some neighborhoods and communities have experienced loss. A lot of this loss, I will name, is driven by extreme storm events. So Superstorm Sandy occurred during this time period, and a lot of that coastal loss occurred during that time. But when we think about equity, one of the most important drivers of human health relative to climate is heat vulnerability. And New York City has a terrific heat vulnerability index that specifies how vulnerable a community is on a variety of factors. And tree canopy is one of those factors and drivers. And we can see as a general trend, it's not always a one-to-one, that the more canopy cover a neighborhood has, in general, the less vulnerable it is. And the less tree canopy tends to be in more heat vulnerable communities. That is also correlated to communities that are lower income and have more people of color. So we know that unfortunately, our urban forest is not a justly distributed asset. So this is just another way of looking at that inequity in distribution, because since the heat vulnerability index actually includes tree canopy, we can also look at tree canopy relative to social vulnerability, and we'll see a really similar trend line there. But when you think about our urban forest, an urban forest is such an interesting system because it's so dependent on management by people. And the urban forest in New York City is managed by many people and agencies, and it has many distinct jurisdictions. So just over half of it, the canopy, is under the care of the New York City Parks Department, but much of the rest of it is under a variety of different city agencies, federal landowners, state landowners, and a huge proportion of it, just over 35%, is actually under private ownership. And so there is sort of disparate management of the resource. There's also, because much of the asset is in public holding, we've done some analysis to look at the scale of budget. And for a sort of long time period, the urban forest has received very small amounts of the city's budget, well under 0.1%, despite the tremendous social and economic and environmental benefits that it offers. We can also take a look not only at the sort of amount of funding availability, but the variability. And we know that unfortunately, the urban forest is often first on the chopping block, no pun intended, when it comes to city budgets and tough years. And so part of thinking about resilience is not only thinking about the biophysical resilience of the system, but also the policy and the budget landscape in which it operates. So the urban forest has many strengths. It is healthy and expanding in many ways. We have a lot of diverse people and institutions who steward it. We have strong leadership from New York City Parks, and there are expansion opportunities, which we'll talk about in a moment. But it faces inequitable distribution, inconsistent policy, insufficient and insecure funding, and we don't always know a lot about what New Yorkers really think of the urban forest, which makes it harder to do programmatic planning. And of course, it faces issues around climate change and pests and diseases. So I want to take you for a moment on a journey with me that my team went through when people said to us, okay, so this is how much we have and you want to expand it. How do you want to expand it? So we undertook an analysis called our practical canopy analysis. It's not the most exciting name, but I think it's an exciting analysis. And we wanted to answer how much canopy could we get without fundamentally changing the underlying landscape, because that's obviously a more difficult exercise. This is just a list of some of our contributors and products. This was not a product I authored on my own. My colleague, Mike Treglia and Natalia Pyland and Karen Liu played really critical roles in the analytical leadership. So I want to give them a lot of credit for this. But we really wanted to say conceptually, where can new trees be planted and how much canopy could be added without changing the underlying landscape? Can we create a method that could, generate conversation? Can we inform goal setting? And can we use this to actually start real and meaningful dialogues with decision makers and advocates? So we really look at where practical canopy can likely go based on land use. So practical doesn't say where it should go, it says where it could go. Priority canopy would be the next step, and we're not there yet to really say, where do we want it to go based on what we know? So the concept of practical canopy in some ways is very simple. I'm going to show you some easy diagrams, but if this is kind of a basic city landscape with some trees and parks with ball fields and some water and some streetscapes and buildings and roadways and airports, we know that some of this ground can easily take a tree. So we sort of crossed out that ground that can't, and we say, okay, this is ground that actually can take a tree. And then we took it to the next question of, can the tree grow up and out? So can canopy grow? And so that allows us to say, okay, these are the areas where practical canopy can grow. So what we're able to do well with it is it can incorporate canopy opportunity over short buildings and roads, help us know, where canopy can go based on basic land use, and it can give us estimates. It's not a super specific model. We don't have things like underground pipes. So I want to say it is a model. It is not a perfect visualization, but it gave us some really important results. And what we saw was that in every community across New York City, there is opportunity to practically expand canopy, but you also might note that a lot of that opportunity is in areas where there's already higher canopy. And that has to do with the fact that there's a lot of permeable surface and some airspace for canopy to keep growing. So we could potentially replicate inequities if we only went where things were easy and practical. But the good news is we can expand planting now today, and then we still also are going to need to work on underlying dynamics so that we can address inequities. Our study told us that the city without underlying landscape change could actually achieve 40% canopy. So there's tremendous opportunity here. And this slide is a sort of a summary of what I've just shared with you, and I'll have that available for you after. So I want to recap before I talk about what we're doing about it. So New York City trees, again, climate change, pests and pathogens, disparate management, a lack of protection, and until recently, a lack of coordinated planning and cohesive vision. And so building resilience into the social side of the urban forest is tremendously important to us. And that's where Forest for All NYC comes in. So Forest for All NYC is a coalition of over 80 organizations. I'll share a list with you in a moment, but it's important to note that these organizations range from academics, labs like Timon's lab, to large environmental organizations like ours, to community-based organizations, environmental justice organizations, government partners, and even the real estate industry. So a lot of folks love and care for our urban forest. And we really envision a well-understood and resilient urban forest that justly and equitably delivers its multiple benefits to all New York City residents. And the justly and equitably is tremendously important to our cause. We do look at a full life cycle of the urban forest: protection, maintaining, using, monitoring, understanding, promoting, and expanding. So there's not just one element that we're paying attention to. And you don't need to read this whole list, but it is important to me to share with you all that a lot of different kinds of stakeholders come to the table to advocate the New York City urban forest agenda and our vision, because I think they see the relative benefits to advancing that goal for their own causes. But as I've mentioned, the urban forest agenda is not only about the urban forest. It's about human health and well-being. It's about climate change adaptation. It's about environmental justice, connection to nature, coordinating and collaboration, ongoing understanding in science, having a citywide scale and a local presence. And of course, it's about the actual state of the trees themselves. So this group advances the New York City urban forest agenda. This is also something I would encourage you to take a look at. We're very proud of it. The New York City urban forest agenda is 12 comprehensive actions that look across the full life cycle of trees and seek to create a roadmap for how we can protect, maintain, sustain, and expand and promote the New York City urban forest. Our first goal, it does tie back to the practical canopy analysis. And we established a goal for New York City of achieving at least 30 by 35, a 30% canopy cover by 2035 equitably. And we established that based on science and expert opinion. We view it as visionary and achievable, informed by our own data and analysis. We wanted a reasonable time horizon. We didn't want a 2050 goal because we were afraid that would not compel near-term action, but we also wanted something far enough out that trees could grow. And we wanted something that folks could talk about easily. It will, though, I want to name, in order to get to 30 by 35, a lot of folks perceive that I think we should just be planting trees. I love planting trees. Just as importantly, we must protect and maintain what we have. If we plant more and we lose existing trees, we will not be in a better place than we are today. So it truly requires both. That management, maintenance, and stewardship is critical. We do need new plantings and expansion of trees across all sectors and geographies. We need a heavy focus in New York City, at least, on engaging private property owners who have a tremendous amount of both existing canopy which could expand, and also room for new plantings. The New York City Urban Forest Agenda is not only a plan for a canopy goal. We have 4 main bodies of intent. So we do want, in the planning phase, to achieve that broader canopy goal. We also think it's terrifically important that individual communities and neighborhoods develop their own local plans. We have several terrific examples of where this has occurred. We think the city needs a comprehensive master plan for the urban forest that cuts across public and private jurisdictions. We think there needs to be significant attention to workforce development and careers. I was hearing again just today that the city really struggles to hire arborists and climbers, and yet there are a lot of unemployed and underemployed New Yorkers who could potentially fill that role with appropriate training. We do think there needs to be increased funding for the urban forest, and I'm excited to hear from Timon more about the Inflation Reduction Act. We also have a bond act in New York State that we think can contribute. We think the regulatory landscape needs to be improved, and there needs to be more standardized management across different land types. We also, from a life cycle perspective, the issue of wood waste from both intentional removals, natural senescence or death of trees, and of course, catastrophic events where we lose a lot of trees, like an extreme storm, creates a big waste stream of wood waste. And that can either go into our waste stream or it can be captured and repurposed and really part of our sustainability and even economic development life cycle. And then, of course, we want to celebrate the urban forest and research it in a variety of ways. So we're working together with folks to create a better research agenda. Last year, we launched our first ever City of Forest Day, where over 30 organizations hosted over 50 events to bring New Yorkers out to celebrate, use, and promote and care for the urban forest. And we, of course, care about ongoing monitoring. So I've said a mouthful about what we want to do in New York City. I'm terrifically excited to hear from all of you. And I think we'll just leave you with the message that I would love to reinforce, which is when we think about resilience and equity of our urban forest, we have to think about the trees, but we truly have to think about the people in the communities and how we are resourcing them as well. So with that, I think I can stop my share and Timon, hand it over to you. But thank you all so much for having me, and I'm eager for your questions.
Super. Thanks so much, Emily. And I just want to make sure someone tells me that you can both see my screen and hear me before I keep going. Yes, Emily, that was great. As usual, it's always amazing to get to tag team presentations with you. Thanks so much for the overview. I want to pick up on 2 aspects of what you talked about, especially the equity aspects, not only in terms of who has access to the forest, but also the benefits the forest provides. And also this other P, you talked about the practical approach, and I also want to think about how we prioritize. One of the things that's kind of amazing about the state of the urban forest is how much more knowledge we have and the amazing work that your team has done since early work of trying to really get a handle on the variety of benefits that we have from the urban forest, and not only the urban forest, but beyond the urban forest, including shrubs and grass areas, the wider green space within New York City. And some of this early work was simply to try to understand that spatial variation. We've come a long way. I think the work that you showed gives us not only a state of the urban forest, but the state of the art, and really understanding what the urban forest, what our knowledge about the urban forest can really tell us. But really what I want to go with this is to think about, when we talk about the urban forest, to talk about it in the context of it as a potential solution to help us climate regulate the city. And one of the facts about New York City, especially for those on the call who are not that aware of New York City, is the multiple climate risks that we face. One of the things that our work is trying to do is to really move the city into thinking about how we plan, how we invest, including in the urban forest, for solutions in a multi-hazard framework, meaning how do we start to think about the fact that the same communities are oftentimes facing the same kinds of climate impacts, sometimes at the same time, and certainly in the same places. And so when you start to layer some of the heat exposure, flooding from extreme rainfall, coastal flooding, we start to see some of these patterns that you started to mention, Emily, in terms of the disproportionate impacts of certain kinds of things that happen in the city. And here I want to draw attention to the disproportionate exposure to a variety of kind of climate impacts. So I'm going to spend a couple more minutes to dig into this just a little more deeply so we can set the scene for really why investing in the urban forest is so important in New York City. And I'm going to end with thinking about this at a national scale as well. But again, just to emphasize a little bit around the heat vulnerability, one of the things that we can see is that there are certain parts of the city that, Emily, you mentioned here, so I'll go quickly through this, that are hotter than others. And those are the same areas where we have a very steady, repeated pattern of communities that are low income, African-American and Black communities, and immigrant communities that are more exposed to heat. We've done similar work to try to understand where coastal flood exposure may be disproportionate as well. And one of the things that we see there is that the communities that are living in environmental justice areas in the city are also disproportionately exposed to coastal flooding. And that's because, and we can go into this even more, the long-standing histories of discriminatory housing policies and other kinds of structural problems in the way in which New York City has been developed and planned that place low-income Black and brown communities in areas that are more at risk. So here, a sort of headline from this research is really emphasizing that about 800,000 people who are living in what are considered environmental justice communities, meaning they're already facing challenges of disproportionate exposure to air pollution or to industrial sites, are also living below the 100-year floodplain. So we can start to see the aggregation of combined exposure to some of the climate challenges. After Hurricane Harvey devastated Houston in 2017, New York City got very serious about extreme rainfall and commissioned a major study called the New York City Stormwater Resiliency Study in 2018 to model where flooding is likely to occur under different kinds of extreme rainfall events. This is a project I co-led with colleagues at Brooklyn College and other places. The result of that was the first ever New York City Stormwater Resiliency Plan in May 2021. Interestingly, this plan was released, the first plan of its kind, not only for New York City, but for cities all across the country, just a couple months before the extreme rainfall storm, the aftermath of Hurricane Ida happened later in September in 2021. The reason I'm mentioning this, though, is because one of the outcomes of this was the development of hydrological models that can project where flooding is likely to occur, at what depth, how long it's going to stay there, and how long it will take to recede in different parts of the city. Here you're looking at a sort of extreme storm, but not so different than the Ida storm, which was 3.1 inches that fell in 1 hour as measured in Central Park. Here it's a hypothetical storm that was 3.5 inches in an hour. But one of the things you can see is that it floods everywhere. So when we think about where to prioritize nature-based solutions, one of the ways to think about that is where the hazard is most pronounced. So where's the flooding? But as Emily already mentioned, that's not the only way we can start to think about not only where we might expand tree canopy from a practical perspective, but from a prioritization standpoint, which what I'm going to argue has at least two layers. One is how can we make sure that we're investing in the urban forest and urban green space more broadly in the city as a natural climate solution both from a hazard context, but also from a who needs it most context. And one of the things that you can see here is a recent study that we're finishing right now. So this is kind of, a window into science in process, so it's not completed, but looking at the ways in which we can take those previous flood maps to try to understand where flooding is most likely, where people will be most exposed, and then look at who's most vulnerable to that exposure to try it again to understand where interventions need to be prioritized to protect the low income, the elderly, the minority and immigrant populations, for example. And we see patterns again. We see disproportionate access not only to solutions like the urban forest, but also the exposure and the vulnerability. And that's what you're looking at in this map. This is a combination of looking at those social variables on top of where exposure is high for that kind of flooding. Ultimately, what we're really trying to do is help think about exactly that word that you mentioned, Emily, the prioritization, how we can prioritize solutions that can address the hazards themselves, but be focused on those who need the most in the context of recognizing that we're dealing with multiple hazards simultaneously. And so I'm doing this deep dive, I'm done with it, but I'm doing this deep dive on some of the ways in which the city is facing some really enormous, not only current climate challenges, but future climate challenges. So we can think about how do we invest in the urban forest the way you've been outlining in a way that helps protect those who need it most. So as you mentioned, and I borrowed a slide from the Nature Conservancy, just to reemphasize the great work that's done. We're talking about trees today. We're talking about the urban forest and the importance of the urban forest for a variety of benefits, but also for climate regulation, for absorbing stormwater, for cooling the city. And the last little bit to really emphasize this point about how can we prioritize is a bit of a complicated study. So I'm going to walk you through it really quickly, but it's simply to say that where we have the supply of a solution and where we have the most need or demand for the solution, we found tend to be mismatched. And what I mean by that is if you look at on the left for where we have, and this is not only the urban forest you're looking at, just to be clear, this is the urban forest and other green spaces. So that includes lawn areas and shrub areas. Where we have the most supply for cooling the city, where we have the most supply for absorbing stormwater is on the left. In the middle, you can see where we've looked at the need for stormwater absorption, where we've looked at the need from the social vulnerability perspective for those communities that have the most need for stormwater absorption or for cooling. That's in the middle. And on the right is where we see the mismatch. So in the red on the right are the areas of the city that have the most need and the least supply. So this sort of supply and demand in a simple kind of language way is trying to help us think about how we can prioritize our investments in areas that really can decrease this mismatch and provide the supply where it's needed most. And I'll just give you two examples to kind of zero in on this. If that was the right side of that figure, that's what you're looking at now. Here are some areas where there's high mismatch. One of the things that people always talk about when I present these maps is, why is Manhattan such a high mismatch? Why is there so much need and low supply? One of those reasons is because this also includes population density. There's more need where there's more people, and there's also more need where there's more people who are low income, Black, brown communities, and others that are part of this vulnerability index that has been used in multiple ways in New York City to try to understand this aspect of need. So here you're looking at areas in the city where we can use this kind of analysis to prioritize investments in the urban forest and another greening and blue infrastructure nature-based solutions for dealing with temperature, with high temperatures and heat waves, for dealing with stormwater and the need to absorb that stormwater, so through runoff mitigation. Also for thinking about things like air pollution, where the air pollution is high and the need for solutions for air pollution, again, is also high. So these are, again, some ways where we can start to use this kind of analysis and work that's been produced in the Urban Systems Lab, along with other collaborators, to begin to think about that prioritization of where we need to be investing in the urban forest. Now, as Emily mentioned, access to the urban forest is inequitable. What we also saw was during the first wave of the pandemic in New York City, that not only is the spatial access to the urban forest and other parks and open space uneven and inequitable, the perception is too. People were concerned in a survey that we did early on in the pandemic about safety, about whether some of the parks where a lot of our trees are that people have access to, whether those parks are being maintained in the same way. And we found that in many neighborhoods, as the parks budgets were cut, as you mentioned, Emily, these are some of the first budgets to get cut. We also saw unevenness in terms of how that remaining funding was being distributed and who had access, not just to be able to be in a park, but to be in a park that they felt safe in, that was being maintained, and that was high quality. And so this is another issue for thinking about not simply the investment in the forest, as you mentioned, Emily, but also the ways in which we're investing in maintenance, that has to be, those equity considerations and justice considerations have to be there in terms of where we plant new trees, how we maintain existing trees, how we manage the parks and open space where a lot of our urban forests are. Another study, and I'm just going to go to the national scale for a little bit of our national audience here, that we've done also with some Nature Conservancy collaborators, but led by a colleague, Erica Spotswood, shows very similar patterns to what I've just shown you in New York for 5,000 cities and towns across the United States. This is the most comprehensive study that I'm aware of that really looks at the inequitable access to urban green space in the cities and towns across the United States. It's a little bit hard to see, but I'm going to walk you through because there's some really important results here. On the far left is looking at who has green space in their neighborhood. And one of the major components of green space is the forest canopy. And you can see in the far left bar that the lower bar, the lower amount of green space is in communities that are majority communities of color, and that majority white communities have more green space in their neighborhoods. This is a national trend that's extremely persistent. So what we're talking about in New York City is also a national problem. So when we think about how we can prioritize investments in the urban forest, maintenance of the urban forest for the kinds of natural climate solutions that they can provide, we have to be doing this not just in New York City, but across all cities and towns across the US. That second column shows a very similar pattern, but it's access to parks. And we see again that white neighborhoods on the right have more access to parks than communities of color. In the right, where we start to get into the 4 bars, we see this also by income, that the low income have the lowest amount of green space in the light green bar, and the darkest green bar there is the highest income quartiles that have the highest amount of green space. And again, you see the same pattern with higher income having more access to parks and lower income having less. So Emily opened with this set of headlines about equity and access to the urban forest. One of the things that the analysis is really making extremely clear is that any efforts that we have in investing in natural climate solutions through our urban forest, where 84+% of all Americans live in this country, is going to have to take seriously these equity issues. I take some positive news from some recent investments that have been made at the federal government level. So if you're not aware, on Earth Day last year in 2022, the Biden-Harris administration signed an executive order that invests in forests. There's real commitment here currently within the federal administration, including with the dollars behind it, to strengthen the forest. One of the things that's interesting, though, is this is the first major federal investment naming nature-based solutions as a national strategy for dealing with the climate change challenge, both from the mitigation and adaptation side. This executive order did 3 things. It launched a national capital accounting initiative. And this is probably the least sexy, but most important part of this executive order, because it says that we have to account for the benefits of nature and bring that into all statistical accounting across all federal agencies. This essentially means that nature now has to be valued in the way we value all work happening across our federal agencies. Again, not something anyone normally on the street is going to be paying attention to, but this has the opportunity to really revamp the way we think about the value of natural climate solutions, but even beyond that, our natural capital more broadly. The second thing that it did is it called for a roadmap, and this roadmap was actually just launched in November at the same time as COP27, the global climate meeting. And in November, the launch of the US roadmap on nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation and mitigation, which lays out a whole variety of strategies that the federal government is taking and a plan to invest in nature-based solutions. This includes billions of dollars for forests, for wetlands. And that additional funding is also coming out through the IRA Act that was previously mentioned, that is providing, again, tens of billions of dollars for investing in forests, wetlands, and other kinds of ecosystems. I will say, though, that there is work to do to push the actual spending and implementation to make sure that it comes to cities, because the benefits, the direct benefits of natural climate solutions for human health and well-being is going to happen in cities. And we need to make sure that we are all mobilizing for those resources to be coming to invest in the urban forest, and not only forest and wetlands at other national scales. The third piece, and one of the last comments I'll make here, is that it also calls for the establishment of the first national nature assessment in the United States. You may be familiar with the National Climate Assessment. The National Climate Assessment is in its fourth assessment cycle. It's a major source and one of the most trusted sources for climate information in the United States. Now we will finally start to have, and this process is just unrolling now, a similar assessment process on the state of nature across the nation. And again, we have some work to do to make sure that the state of the urban forest across all cities and towns is part of this assessment, so we can really track and understand and evaluate the urban forest as a natural climate solution. So I'm going to close there and just say thanks. I think there's some enormous work for us ahead of us, but because of some of the amazing work that Emily's group has been doing, the coalition that she's been and her team has been building across New York City, we have some really positive movements that are happening in New York City. We have similar challenges at national level, but again, there's some really positive momentum and funding and resources that are starting to flow. So I look forward to taking questions, and thanks.
Great. Thank you both so much for your presentations. Fantastic work. So with our remaining time, which is approximately 15 minutes, we're going to move into Q&A portion of the webinar. So we've been monitoring our chat feature and email as well, and we'll start with those questions. Just one at the moment. Please don't be shy for your questions in the chat, the Q&A. But we'll start with the first question that we have in the Q&A section, which is directed to Emily, I believe. Will the master plan include methods to protect tree beds, both existing and new? And they note that practices like ground cover and perimeter fencing are important features.
Yeah, that's a great question. And my answer is we hope so. So the way that this works is Forest for All NYC has basically said, hey, City of New York, you need a master plan for this resource, or a comprehensive plan, or whatever we want to call it. We are working hard on enumerating basically the scope of what that plan should include. And one of the things that we believe in is that there should be more clear and consistent standards for sort of the full life cycle of tree planting. So absolutely, tree beds should be adequately prepared. Technical difficulties. So anyway, back to the really good question about tree beds. We really agree that tree beds should be, standardized to be the right size. We need to make sure that the soil or substrate within them is useful, and couldn't agree more about ensuring that New York City, we call them tree guards. I think the term was perimeter fencing in the question. But yeah, so we hope that in the creation of a master plan, if we can persuade the city that this should be an activity for them to undertake, that kind of standard specification will be established.
Excellent. Thank you, Emily. Yeah, the next question is for Timon, if you have the feasibility at the moment. Yes, so there's been mapping exercises you explained around the feasibility of establishing new parks and open spaces in New York, particularly at the scale suggested by the 330-300 rule. I was wondering if you could talk about what that might mean for the current land use and zoning in New York City.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Emily kind of addressed this a little bit, in that the practical side of that is a huge part of it, right? Where can we put trees? Where can we put trees physically? Where can we put trees legally? And one of the things that I guess we're going to have to probably deal with is that if we want to reach a 30% canopy goal, and we want to do that in a way that's equitable, that I don't know, Emily, you probably have a better thought about this, but when we start to think about where all those trees can go to reach those goals, but to do it in an equitable way, we may need to think about zoning. We may need to create some both incentives and some top-down pushes to think about how development efforts can really kind of address this in terms of putting forests in as part of various kinds of developments that are going to be happening around the city. I think this is really ultimately about thinking about the role of various city institutions and how they can bring this as part of their portfolio. And we're going to have to think about it across legal, economic, various kinds of social practices as well. And then, some of this is also us all, and I think this is something, Emily, that your team is doing amazingly in terms of this coalition building and creating events and awareness. This is also helping New Yorkers all across New York see the urban forest as their forest, and seeing that this planting is not just about, say, rezoning an area and making sure that whatever development is getting green light, the trees are part of that investment. This is also about greening our backyards. This is about thinking differently about the various kinds of paved services that we might have that we perhaps don't need as much of. And certainly if we want to make the city less flashy in terms of the kinds of flooding impacts that we have, if we want to make it cooler, then and we want to provide more space for trees, and I think we're going to have to think about that infrastructure that isn't just because there's an existing tree pit. Where can we put in more tree pits? Where can we actually pull up pavement and reduce the amount of pavement? How can we take the roads back from car-centric development that the city has really developed for the last 100 years? And we're doing it for bike lanes. Let's do it to expand the urban forest as well. And there's going to be so many benefits associated with that.
Awesome. Emily, did you have any thoughts on that, or do you want to follow up with a new question?
I'll add a couple of specifics because I think Timon said it really well. But if we're very serious, right, about greening and improving our most heat vulnerable communities, one of the most interesting and important property types we can take a look at is public housing. So New York City Housing Authority, that's what we call our public housing in New York City, they actually occupy just over 1%, about 1.15% of New York City's land. So that is actually quite a lot of land. That land is in some of the most heat vulnerable communities in that heat vulnerability index. And it often is some of the sparse open space and tree canopy in those communities. And it has really important potential for not only improving the management of that, because New York City Housing Authority isn't a parks agency. And until recently, they really didn't have a plan or resources to care for their trees. And that's something they are working hard to accomplish. And they should be commended for that work. They've been inventorying their existing trees. And a note about this, is a very large proportion of their trees, something on the order of 25%, are very large, old, beautiful, but old London planes. And because you have a bit of a monoculture in terms of both species and age class, there really needs to be some forethought, because as those trees start to senesce or we lose them in storms, we could be losing large portions of canopy in some of our most heat vulnerable communities. So from my perspective, everything Timon said is right. And then there are some specific property types. So NYCHA also, I should note, even though they're only 1.15% of the city's property, they're over 2% of the city's tree canopy. So they're actually playing this incredible and important outsized role. And they have space for more planting. So in my eyes, this is why I love our parks department. I want us to be caring for those trees. We have to be investing in the care and maintenance of trees on NYCHA properties if we're serious about equity, and in ongoing planting. And the incredible thing is there are some organizations doing that with an eye towards workforce and training young NYCHA residents in the great science of tree inventories, and also now in stewardship and planting. So it's a really big potential area. And then I'll just put the plug in that in a lot of these communities, you can also do things, think about schoolyard transformation. Like we have a lot of hardscape schoolyards. That's a really important area from the, ecological, but also that environmental education benefit perspective. So I think it's about getting creative based on land use and prioritizing where we can really provide those benefits to people while we're also changing that underlying landscape.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. One of the things that you just sparked curiosity in was the idea of workforce. And I'm wondering, outside of funding, which seems to be, such a foundational issue for this kind of work, what kind of impediments are you finding with, say, workforce or seed sourcing, sapling sourcing? Like, what are the issues outside of funding that you're facing in urban forestry?
I'll take a crack in time, and I would love to hear what you would offer. One real improvement that we saw in New York City after the original Million Trees initiative was that the city committed to long-term tree procurement contracts. So for those of you who are like municipal contracting wonks, this one's for you. It takes a while to grow trees, so we need to like actually plan that palette and secure them and pay for them ahead of time. So that's been a really like a good addition. And I think we need to think more strategically about those longer term contracts. It's not just the money side. Candidly, there's a dearth of well-qualified contractors to do tree planting and tree maintenance. The Parks Department, as I briefly mentioned, has been challenged to find folks who will apply for and fill the job of tree climber and pruning, this ongoing need. I think there's a few things at play there. I think part of it is cultural. I think a lot of folks, like I'm a nature nerd from New York City, but a lot of folks may not perceive that they can have this incredible outdoor nature-based job. And so making that a field that is appealing to like the environment that looks like New York City and then paying it well will be important. So I think it is about the funding, but it's also about the culture and the sort of taking this as an economic development opportunity better, because what's interesting is trees are one of the few pieces of infrastructure that get more valuable as they sit in place. And yet we do not take them seriously in that way.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add is like an underlying what Emily just said is the need for an increased recognition of the challenges that our trees face, right? So how do we mobilize more resources to train workforce, to create workforce development around, forest stewardship, forest maintenance, all those critical things about, pruning, even watering trees during August, which is such a drought-driven type of month. Young trees when they're planted, right? Even if we have contractors who are paid to maintain them for the first couple of years, year 3, all of a sudden we really need that stewardship core that's focused on helping them get through those weaker years until they're a little bit older and they start to have more of a canopy, both because they're providing more benefits at that point, but they're also stronger and more resilient. And we didn't talk about this. I want to come back to the issue of how do we make sure the forest is more resilient? One of the ways is to recognize that that just doesn't happen in some like magic way, right? We have got to invest in that workforce development, in that training, and have the resources there. And I think one of the ways is to really shine a light on the fact that our trees are constantly under stress. They're stressed from pollution, they're stressed from human impact, they're stressed from pests. Pest is related to climate change. They're stressed from storms. Emily mentioned the storm damage that we've had to deal with in terms of thousands of trees being lost in some individual storms. I think elevating that is a way to help mobilize the need for resources together with the recognition of the vast benefits that the urban forest provides for people are both sides of that. And I just kind of want to come back to that sort of trees deal with a tough urban environment. And that when we think about resilience, which is kind of like how we started the beginning of this talk, how are we going to make New York City more resilient and how can urban forests be part of that? We have to think about the trees themselves being resilient if they're going to help provide human and infrastructure resilience for the city. And that's not always thought about very much. And I think it's a huge part of this. And of course, training and acculturating people to the value of both the forest, but also the kind of job that you mentioned that they could have that may not be common to be thought of. This is part of that for sure.
I love that. It's such a through line with forestry at every scale, rural and urban. This thought that nature will heal itself, or that resilience built itself into these systems. And it's just not the case anymore, and this investment is so important. So unfortunately, we're just about at time. We're gonna have to close our session, even though I have many more questions to ask you too. I'd just like to thank you both so much for your time, your information. It was a pleasure to hear both presentations. And so again, the webinar recording and slides will be posted within a few days on the website. And to be including on our mailing list and to receive registration details in the future, please email forestsc@msu.edu. Before you head off, please take a look at the speaker lineup shared on the screen now. With that, I hope you all have a great afternoon, and thank you again, Emily and Timon.
Thanks, Tony, for hosting. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Who put this together. It was a pleasure. Thanks, Emily, as always.
Thank
care.
you all. Have a great one. Bye.